She baked him a cake with her own hands. She stitched wildflowers into her collar. She stood in the corridor of a palace that was never meant for her, waiting for a man who was already laughing at her name in the next room. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not the betrayal, not the humiliation, not the sound of your own heart hitting marble. Nobody warns you how quiet the world goes right before everything breaks. Stay with me tonight. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like, because this story belongs to every wolf who ever survived loving the wrong person before finding the one who was terrified of losing them. The training yard of Drenmore smelled like iron and wet stone before the sun even crested the eastern wall, and that was exactly why Seraphine Vale was already there. Most of the fortress guards arrived after the dawn bell. They came with sleep still creasing their faces, yanking leather bracers onto their wrists, trading flat insults the way soldiers do when the hours haven't warmed yet and conversation costs too much energy. Seraphine was always there before them, not because regulation required it, because silence required it. The yard was the only place inside Drenmore's walls where nobody looked at her long enough to ask questions, and questions, in her experience, had a way of unraveling everything a woman spent years carefully building. She was working a practice sword through its third rotation arc when the first guard she'd come to tolerate, a broad-shouldered she-wolf named Mira, dropped onto the stone bench at the yard's edge and watched her with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to speak. Seraphine finished the arc, started the fourth. "You've been out here since before the birds," Mira said. "Birds are lazy. It's your birthday." The sword didn't slow. "Noted." Mira pulled a strip of dried elk from her coat and chewed it with the patience of someone who had learned that silence, in Seraphine's presence, was never the end of a conversation. It was just where the real one started. "Theron sent word," Mira said finally. "He's attending the Cold March feast tonight, Noble Hall. He said he'd expect you to join him." The arc completed. Seraphine lowered the blade and pressed the flat of it against her forearm, feeling the cool metal, grounding herself against the small hot thing that moved through her chest at the sound of that name. She had been 2 years in Drenmore, 2 years without her real name, without her bloodline, without the weight of a crown she'd fled before it could be placed on her head. She had come here as nobody. She had intended to stay nobody. Theron Valacrest had made that harder than it should have been. "He said he'd expect me," she repeated. His exact word, expect. Mira didn't editorialize. She didn't have to. Seraphine drove the practice sword into the dirt and looked at the wall. Drenmore's fortress walls were black granite quarried from the northern ridges, laced with iron veining that caught morning light in ways that looked almost beautiful from a distance. Up close, they were just rock. That was the thing about Drenmore that had taken her the longest to understand. Everything here looked formidable from a distance. Everything here was just structure up close, walls, titles, men. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. She meant it when she said it. She even believed it for most of the afternoon. The cake had been Mira's idea, technically, though Seraphine had done the work. Drenmore's kitchens closed to non-staff after the third bell, but the head cook, an older she-wolf named Betta, who had served the fortress for 30 years and possessed the unsettling gift of knowing which guards to tolerate and which to quietly sabotage, had left the side door unlocked and a stack of decent flour on the secondary counter. Seraphine had taken that as permission. She wasn't sentimental by nature. She had learned very young that sentiment was a luxury, like silk or unhurried mornings, things that required a stability she'd spent most of her life outrunning. But she was 24 years old today, and she was in a fortress where nobody knew her real name, and she had been looking at Theron Valacrest's mouth for 2 years with an ache she could not entirely explain or entirely suppress. And sometimes a woman needed one small moment that was hers alone before she handed the rest of the evening over to other people's expectations. So she made the cake. Honey and dark rye flour, pressed dried winter berries into the surface, dusted the whole thing with coarse cane sugar because Betta kept a jar of it on the corner shelf. It wasn't elegant. The surface cracked slightly in the cooling. One edge sat lower than the other in a way that looked deliberate if you tilted your head. She carried it wrapped in cloth through the back corridors toward the noble hall, not because she planned to present it like some kind of declaration, but because she intended to eat at least one slice before the night became a performance. That was when she heard his voice. The corridor that ran behind the east wall of the noble hall had a gap between the old stone partition and the newer plaster, a structural oversight that fortress architects had apparently decided was someone else's problem. Sound moved through it clearly. Seraphine had walked this route 100 times and never lingered, because nothing good came from hearing what nobles said when they thought the walls were just walls. Tonight she stopped. The problem with her, Theron was saying, and his voice carried the easy, unconstrained quality of a man deep into his second cup of wine among people he trusted completely, is that she actually believes it. Laughter, several voices. Believes what? A man she didn't recognize. That I intend to marry a woman with no house behind her. He said it the way you say something obvious, the way you say, of course the sky is dark, of course water is cold. Not cruel exactly, just certain. She's useful. The king watches her, for whatever reason, and proximity to the king's attention is worth more than half the titles in this room. But marry her! She's a guard, Aldous. She sleeps in the barracks. Seraphine stood very still. The cloth in her hands felt heavier than it should have. She doesn't seem to know that, another voice observed. No, Theron agreed, and there was something almost affectionate in it, the way you might speak of a loyal dog who had learned the wrong command. She doesn't, and that's what makes her useful. A woman who thinks she's loved is a woman who stays close. A pause, the sound of liquid being poured. Tonight's her birthday, apparently. I'll give her an hour, make her feel seen. She'll hold on for another 6 months at least. More laughter. Softer this time. Comfortable. The laughter of men who had never once considered that a woman could be listening. The wrapped cake dropped before Seraphine understood she had released it. It hit the floor and the cloth split, and the honey rye cake with its cracked surface and its dried winter berries came apart against the dark stone in a way that should not have felt symbolic, but did. The coarse sugar scattered. The lower edge broke cleanly away. She looked at it for one long moment with the particular stillness of a person whose body has gone very quiet around a very loud interior. Then she walked away from it. She walked through the back corridor and out into the cold yard, and she kept walking until the fortress gates were behind her and the wind off the northern hills was cutting through her guard jacket in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the fact that she needed her skin to feel something external before she trusted herself to feel anything internal. She had been so careful. That was the thing she could not stop returning to as she sat on the ridge outside Drenmore's walls with her back against a frostbitten pine and her knees pulled to her chest and her jaw tight against everything she refused to allow herself to become in this moment. She had been so precisely, exhaustingly careful. 2 years without her name. 2 years without her bloodline sigil or her father's title, or any of the architecture of identity that had made her a target before she learned how to disappear. She had built herself a life that was small and solid and hers. She had let herself feel one thing for one person, and she had misjudged even that. The moon was 3/4 full. Drenmore's towers cut into it from the south. She thought, not for the first time and with a clarity that surprised her by being almost peaceful, that she could leave tonight. She had done it before. She knew how to walk away from places that had stopped being safe. She had a pack animal stabled in the lower yard. She had traveling coins sewn into the lining of her second jacket. She had learned, young, early, at her father's knee, even if he hadn't intended to teach it, that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was stay somewhere past the moment it stopped serving her. She was still sitting there, not yet moving but very close to it, when she heard boots on the frost-hardened grass behind her. She turned. Alpha King Draven Kalor stood at the edge of the tree line, with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who had not entirely decided what to do with himself, which was not an expression she had seen on his face before and which looked almost foreign on features that had always struck her as carved for certainty. He was in plain clothes, no ceremonial coat, no rank insignia, just a dark wool overshirt with the collar open against the cold. He was taller than most men in Drenmore and broader than his officers tried to account for when standing beside him in formal arrangements, and his jaw carried 2 days of growth he hadn't bothered to address. He looked, in that particular moment, not like a king. He looked like someone who had followed a trail because the trail mattered. "The back corridor," he said. It wasn't a question. Seraphine looked at him for a moment. Were you following me? No. He paused. Yes. Another pause. I was coming from the armory. The corridor is on the route. His voice was flat and precise, and she had learned that this was how he spoke when he was being careful. Draven Kalor never rambled. When he used extra words, it was because the first set hadn't landed where he meant them to. I heard the same conversation you did. The cold moved between them. Then you heard nothing that requires discussion, she said. That's not... He stopped, looked away from her briefly toward the dark line of the hills. She watched the muscle work in his jaw. Valicrest is a coward. That should be said directly. Thank you for the assessment. She said it without heat, without anything, really. She was too tired for heat. You can go back now. He didn't move. She looked at him again, and something about the quality of his stillness unsettled her in a way that was distinct from the 100 other times this man had unsettled her since she had come to Drenmore. He was the most powerful wolf in the known empire. She had spent 2 years being very deliberately unremarkable in his presence. She had done this not because she feared him exactly, though she was not naive enough to pretend his reputation was invented, but because Alpha King Draven Kalor noticed things, and she could not afford to be noticed. And yet he kept appearing in the edges of her days in ways that felt less like coincidence and increasingly like something she didn't have a clean word for. You're going to leave, he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just said the way he said things, directly, as though the air between them couldn't afford to carry softened versions. That's my decision to make. It is. He moved then, not toward her, but to the side, lowering himself onto the slope of the ridge with his forearms across his knees in a posture she had never seen from him in any official context, something almost tired in it. I'm not here to stop you. I don't have that right. She watched him. Then why are you here? He was quiet for a moment. Down in the yard, one of the watch bells sounded the 3rd hour. The sound carried clean in the cold. Because you're sitting alone on a ridge on your birthday, he said, with the look of a person who's about to make a decision that can't be unmade. And I've found... He stopped again, started differently. I've sat with men in that moment, before campaigns, before surrenders. I've learned that the decision made alone on a ridge in the cold is rarely the decision they'd have made in the morning. Seraphine said nothing. I'm not asking you to feel anything different than you feel, Draven said. I'm not asking you to go back in there and pretend you didn't hear what you heard. I'm saying... His voice dropped by a register, not quieter so much as more honest, the way a sound changes when it stops being performed and starts being meant. Don't let him take this from you. Valicrest doesn't deserve to be the reason Drenmore loses someone worth keeping. The wind moved through the pines. Seraphine exhaled slowly. You know my name. Not a question. She had known for some time that he knew. There were ways a man looks at a person he knows nothing about, and ways he looks at a person he knows something about and has decided not to act on, and Draven Kalor had been looking at her with the second kind of attention since her 3rd month in Drenmore. I know your name, he said. You haven't acted on it. No? Why? He looked at her then, directly, and she had learned over 2 years that direct eye contact from an alpha of his caliber was a physical thing, something that moved through the chest cavity and altered the temperature of the room even when there was no room, when they were outside on a ridge under a 3/4 moon with frost on the grass. Because you came here without it, he said, and whatever that cost you, it wasn't my right to take back. She sat with that. It would have been easier if he were cruel. Cruelty she knew how to walk away from. She had done it before. She had walked away from a father's court and an arranged future and 100 moments that required her to be smaller than she was. And she had done all of it without looking back, because the thing about cruelty was that it made the leaving clean. This was not clean. I'm going to ask you something, she said finally. Ask. Did you know what Theron was doing? Using me to stay close to you? Draven's jaw tightened. She watched it happen. I suspected, he said. And you didn't? No. Direct. No hedging. I didn't interfere with who you chose to spend your time with. That wasn't my call. He paused. I should have said something to you directly. I didn't. I don't have a good reason for that. I have a reason. It's not a good one. She waited. He looked back at the hills. Because I was watching for long enough that it stopped being neutral. The words came out with the particular quality of things that have been held back so long, they've lost their smoothness. Not rough exactly, but worn, like stone that's been gripped too hard for too long. And neutral is the only thing I was allowed to be. The cold settled between them, and for a long moment, neither of them filled it. And in that moment, Seraphine became aware of something she had been carefully not becoming aware of for 2 years. Sitting just beneath the surface of all the ordinary routines and the careful anonymity and the mornings in the training yard before the birds arrived. The awareness sat there now in the open air between them and refused to be unacknowledged. She said nothing about it. Instead, she said, "I'll think about staying." Draven nodded once, stood, offered his hand to help her up from the slope, and she took it without allowing herself to think too carefully about the fact that she was taking it, and he pulled her upright with a steadiness that had nothing performative in it. He released her hand, stepped back, became the Alpha King again in the space of a breath. "The armory," he said. "Right." He walked back down the ridge toward the fortress. She watched him go. Then she looked at the dark line of the hills for a long moment before she turned and followed. She didn't leave that night. She told herself it was pragmatism. In the morning, when she had sleep behind her and distance from the cold and the broken cake and the sound of Theron's voice moving through that partition wall, she would evaluate her options with the clear-eyed efficiency she had trained herself to apply to every situation that threatened to become about feeling rather than function. She had coin, she had a horse, she had a name waiting for her somewhere that she wasn't ready to wear again. But she stayed. For 6 weeks she stayed, and the 6 weeks were a particular kind of difficult she hadn't fully anticipated, because Drenmore was a small fortress in the ways that mattered, and Theron Valicrest was still in it. He came to her 2 days after her birthday with the expression of a man who had rehearsed an apology and found the rehearsal was going well. He brought a small wrapped gift, nothing significant, a carved bone knife handle she had mentioned admiring 3 months prior, and he looked at her with eyes that were warm in exactly the way she had once found compelling. She noticed for the first time how precisely calibrated the warmth was, how it arrived on schedule. "I don't know what you think you heard," he started. She stopped him there. "I know what I heard, Theron." His expression shifted, the warmth recalibrated. "You were listening at a wall?" "I was walking past a corridor." She kept her voice level. "You told a room full of colleagues that I serve a purpose, that I don't know what I am to you, that you'd give me an hour on my birthday and I'd hold on for 6 more months." She watched his face. "I'm not angry." He looked surprised by that. She found the surprise telling. "I'm not angry," she said again, "because anger would mean I'd built something that deserved to be protected. I built a story. You maintained it. We both made choices, and mine were just less informed than yours." She looked at him carefully. "You're a coward, Theron. That's not an insult. It's just what you are. You wanted something close to the king's attention without the risk of actually being the king's man. I was a convenient bridge." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm done being a bridge." He stared at her. The rehearsed warmth had fully departed. What was underneath it was harder to read because it was more genuine. Something caught between embarrassment and the particular offense of a man who expected to manage an outcome and found the outcome had already managed itself without him. "You'll regret this," he said finally. Not threatening, almost confused, as though the words were a reflex. "Probably not," she said. She walked away from that conversation with the steady weight of a woman who had set something down rather than thrown it, which was a different kind of feeling than she'd expected. Less release and more resolution, like a room after a fire has burned out and you can finally see what the walls are actually made of. She was crossing the lower yard when she became aware that she was being watched from the west rampart. She didn't look up. She knew the quality of that attention by now, had known it for months in the way you know a sound you've learned to identify before you can name the source. She kept her walk even and her eyes forward and let the knowledge sit in her chest where it had been sitting for 6 weeks without acknowledgement. The days after that settled into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Training before dawn, morning assignments along the north wall where the border patrols ran heaviest, evenings that were quieter than they had been, because Theron's absence from her daily geography turned out to remove not grief, but a specific kind of ongoing low-level management. She hadn't realized how much effort she had been spending on performing contentment. Without that effort, she had more energy for other things. She noticed, for instance, that the yard at the third hour of practice often contained the Alpha King. Not every day, not in a pattern she could define, but often enough that she had mapped it. He came when the regular officers were occupied with tactical reviews inside, when the yard held only the lower guards and the ambient noise of a fortress moving through its ordinary hours. He didn't use the space the way a king should. There were 4 private training rooms in Drenmore's main building, any one of which he could have occupied. Instead, he came to the open yard with a single practice blade and moved through forms she recognized as older than the standard guard curriculum, from a system that had largely fallen out of military use a generation ago, which meant he had learned it young, which meant someone had taught it to him intentionally. She watched him from the edge of the yard the first time without intending to. Then she watched him from the same spot the next time because she intended to. On the third occasion, he stopped mid-form, didn't look at her directly, and said in a voice pitched just above the wind, "You're going to ruin my count. I'm standing at the yard edge." "Yes." He resumed the form, watching like you're looking for something wrong with it. "There's nothing wrong with it." She paused. "You drop your left shoulder at the transition point." He completed the form, set the blade across his forearm, turned to look at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as the one he used when he found something genuinely unexpected. "Show me." She didn't move immediately, not because she was reluctant, but because she was calibrating the significance of what had just been asked. The Alpha King of the continent requesting a correction from a guard who was currently standing at the edge of his training yard with no formal rank to justify the interaction. She found, when she looked at the calibration directly, that she didn't care. She crossed the yard and took the practice blade he offered and stood in the transition position. "Here," she said. "The weight transfers left before the arm does. You're compensating late." He watched her adjustment with the particular intensity of a man who was not easily corrected and found the correction correct. "Learned that form from my father's old weapons master," he said. "Old methodology. The shoulder was meant to stay open longer for single opponent engagement. In a compound fight, it creates vulnerability. You've studied the old forms." "I've studied most things." She handed the blade back. "You should teach your officers that correction. 3 of them carry the same habit." She turned to leave the yard. "Seraphine." The sound of her name in his voice was a thing she was not prepared for and spent the next 6 days trying to catalog correctly. It wasn't her guard name, which was Senna. Plain, unmemorable, chosen precisely because it required no explanation. He had used her real name in the open air of the training yard, and her body had reacted before her mind processed it, a kind of full system recognition, like a sound heard from very far away that you realize belongs to you. She stopped. Didn't turn fully. Just angled enough to show she'd heard. "Thank you, Sal," he said. Just that. She walked. The message from her father arrived on a gray morning in the 2nd month of the new season. She recognized the carrier before she recognized the seal. Old Corvin, who had been running messages from the Vale Court since before she was born, and whose left knee had accumulated a permanent westward lean from 30 years of mountain route riding. He dismounted in the lower yard and handed her a sealed tube without ceremony, because Corvin had known her since she was 6 years old and didn't need to perform neutrality he already felt. She took the tube inside. The letter was in her father's handwriting, which was small and precise and slightly cramped toward the ends of sentences, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a court that charged for ink and never fully unlearned the economy of it. Seraphine, your position in Drenmore has been located. I am not writing to summon you. That is not something I retain the right to do after the choices I made. I am writing to inform you of a situation that affects you regardless of your decision about the rest. The Alliance offer has been reactivated. Aldrich's hand has been offered to the north. The northern response is pending, and I have reason to believe it involves Drenmore directly. Whatever you choose to do with this information, choose it knowing it fully. Your father. She read it 3 times. Then she sat with it for an hour on the edge of the northern wall where the wind came off the mountains with enough force to make thinking feel physical. She thought about the word reactivated. Her father's use of it was precise. Not reopened, not renewed, but reactivated, implying the offer had never fully closed, which she had not known, which meant that 2 years of carefully built distance had been sitting on top of a thread that was still live. She thought about Northern Response involving Drenmore directly, which meant one of two things. Either the King of Drenmore had been approached as a potential party to the alliance, or he was involved in some mediating capacity. She thought about the timing of the letter, its arrival now, in a season when she had just stripped the last of her performed contentment away and found something cleaner underneath. She thought once about Draven's voice saying her name. Then she stopped thinking about it and went back to work. The day the letter changed, everything was a training day, 6th week after its arrival, which she had spent doing nothing with. She had made no decision, taken no action, written no reply. The information sat in her like an unexploded thing, and she walked around it carefully and kept her routines tight and neat, and when Mira asked her 3 weeks in if everything was all right, she said yes, which was not entirely a lie, but was not entirely accurate either. The encounter happened in the corridor between the armory and the guard barracks, at the end of a long shift that had left her with dust in her collar and a pulled muscle across her left shoulder blade from an overly committed sparring session with the new rotation recruits. She was thinking about the bath at the end of the barracks hall, and nothing else when she rounded the corner and walked directly into Lady Celine Vere. Celine Vere was not a name Seraphine knew well yet, but she had catalogued her in the way she catalogued most people who moved through Drenmore's upper levels, with the comfortable ownership of the well-connected. Tall, pale-haired, the daughter of a regional lord with enough political relevance to have standing invitations at royal events. She had been at Drenmore for 3 weeks, and she moved through its corridors with the proprietary ease of someone who had already decided she belonged. The collision knocked a small embroidered travel case from Celine's hands. It hit the floor, and the clasp gave, and a scatter of personal items went across the stone, including a small sealed letter with an official stamp that landed face up between them. They both looked at it. The stamp was Drenmore's seal, not the public administrative seal, the private mark that came from the king's personal correspondence. Seraphine knew it from 2 years of proximity to paperwork she was not supposed to see, and had seen anyway, because she had learned early that knowing what moved through a fortress was the same as knowing how the fortress worked. Celine crouched and collected her items with swift, unhurried precision. She tucked the letter last. When she stood, she looked at Seraphine with an expression that was pleasant and entirely uninformative. "Apologies," Celine said. "The corner's badly lit." "It is," Seraphine agreed. Celine moved on. Seraphine watched her go and felt the cold, clear sensation of a pattern revealing itself before she had enough information to name it fully. She didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, she sought out Mira and asked, without preamble, "What do you know about Lady Celine Vere?" Mira looked at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this question. "Lord Vere's daughter, here on family business, allegedly." "Allegedly." "She's had 2 private audiences with the king since arriving." Mira ate her breakfast without changing her tone. "Both late in the evening, both unscheduled in the official log." Seraphine said nothing. "I'm not saying anything," Mira said. "You don't have to. I'm just noting that the formal alliance calendar has a new entry from the Northern Response, and the king has been distracted isn't the right word. Quiet. In a way that's different from his normal quiet." Seraphine set her spoon down. She went about the rest of the day with the quiet efficiency of someone assembling a picture from pieces they've been carrying separately and hoping wouldn't connect. They connected. She let them connect because refusing to look at a true thing had already cost her 6 months of her life, and she wasn't interested in repeating that. She came to a decision slowly and then entirely. She would go home. Not because she had been defeated, not because Theron had broken her, or Celine Vere had crowded her out, or the letter from her father had pulled some filial string she couldn't resist. She would go home because staying in Drenmore had become a performance she no longer wanted to give, and because the name she'd put down 2 years ago had not gone anywhere, and because she was 24 years old, with a bloodline that meant something and a future that would not wait forever for her to decide to inhabit it. She told Mira that evening, short, clean, no excess. Mira looked at her for a long time. "Does the king know?" "It's not the king's information to have." "Seraphine, it isn't." She held her gaze. I came here without his knowledge. I'll leave the same way. Mira nodded once, slowly, with the expression of someone who understood and didn't like the understanding. Corvin rides north day after tomorrow. I know. Take care of yourself. I intend to. She packed that evening. Small, precise, nothing she couldn't carry on horseback in weather. She folded her guard jacket last, held it for a moment with both hands, set it on the barracks bench. She had worn it for 2 years. It smelled like iron and frost and the training yard before dawn. She left it. She was crossing the lower yard in the gray pre-dawn hour, pack across her shoulder, headed for the stable, when she heard the door behind her. One set of footsteps. Unhurried, certain of their direction. She stopped. She didn't turn. She stood with the cold morning air on her face and her pack on her shoulder and the stable ahead, and everything she had built here behind her, and she stood there for one long moment making the choice to keep walking. Then she turned. Draven stood at the yard's entrance in a plain coat, arms at his sides, looking at her with an expression she had no category for. Not command, not performance, something she had never seen on his face before and which looked, on his particular features, like a man standing at the edge of something he cannot cross, and has only just understood that he cannot cross it. You're leaving, he said. Yes. The Alliance. Not a question. He had known. Of course he had known. It's time to stop running from my name, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him hold something very still inside himself with the deliberate control of a man who has trained that control over many years for many reasons and finds it, in this particular moment, an insufficient tool. There's something you should know, he said. She waited. He crossed the yard in 4 measured strides and stood 2 feet from her in the gray dawn with the fortress walls around them and the mountains behind him, and he looked at her with direct, serious eyes and said, The northern response to your father's alliance offer. He stopped, started again, which was unlike him, which meant the restart was necessary. It came through my chancellor 3 weeks ago. His jaw worked. I sent it. The yard went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. She looked at him. She looked at him with the full attention of a woman whose entire body had gone still around a very sudden, very large, very consequential understanding. You, she said. Yes. You're the Alliance. Yes. She stared at him. Since when? Since your father's initial inquiry reached the Northern Coalition and I recognized the bloodline. He held her gaze. Since before I knew what I was going to do with that knowledge. Since... He stopped. A long time before I sent the response, Seraphine. A long time. The morning light was beginning at the edges of the eastern wall. Down in the lower city, the first vendor bells of the day. Above them, the sky grading from black to a steel blue that carried no warmth yet. She had been planning to leave. She had packed for it. She had made the choice. She had said the clean words to Mira and left her guard jacket on a barracks bench and turned her back on 2 years of quiet, anonymous living, and she had been going home to inhabit a name and a future. And she had known, somewhere in the process of all that she was also leaving something else. She hadn't let herself identify directly because identifying it would have required action. Draven was looking at her with the expression of a man who has placed the most significant bet of his life on a number he has been watching for years and is now watching the wheel turn. She said, Why didn't you tell me? Because you didn't come here to be found, he said, and I didn't have the right to find you before you were ready to be found. The pack on her shoulder suddenly weighed differently. She looked at him for a long moment in the growing morning light and said nothing at all, because what she was feeling was not something she had a clean word for either, and she had learned, slowly and at some cost, that not everything required a word to be true. She said, The prince my father is expecting. Is me, Draven said. She exhaled. A sound reached them then from above. A guard's voice from the western rampart. 2 sharp words of warning, the quality of alarm in it that any fortress-trained wolf recognized immediately as something other than a drill. Both of them turned. Mira was running across the upper walkway toward them, her face tight with a particular expression Seraphine had learned to read in 2 years of shared shifts. Not fear. Mira didn't fear easily, but something adjacent and more purposeful. My lord. Mira stopped at the yard's edge, breathing fast, eyes on Draven. The southern riders arrived in the night, Valicrest among them. She glanced at Seraphine once, a glance that carried an entire separate conversation in it. He brought the king's personal seal, your private correspondence seal. Her voice dropped. He's calling for a council session, says he has evidence. She stopped, chose the next word with visible care. Evidence of improper contact between the crown and a member of the guard. He's naming her. The morning light fell cold and even across the yard. Seraphine felt the air leave her lungs in a controlled, deliberate way, the breathing of a woman who has been ambushed before and knows that the body's first job in an ambush is to stay functional. Draven was very still beside her. He has my seal, he said quietly. Yes, my lord. I didn't write anything with that seal that could... He stopped. His voice changed. Celine. The name landed between all three of them. Mira said nothing. Seraphine said nothing. The answer was already in the silence. Celine Veyer with her private audiences and her embroidered travel case and the sealed letter she had moved with such precise, unhurried hands. The letter that bore the king's private mark. Seraphine thought about the words Theron had spoken through a partition wall on her birthday. The Alpha King seemed strangely protective of her. She is close to him. She is useful. She thought about how precisely useful she had remained to Theron Valicrest even after she had stopped being his. She thought about the look on Draven's face 30 seconds ago when he had told her the truth and the look on his face right now, which was the look of a man understanding that someone has reached into the inside of something he had protected without knowing he was protecting it and used that protection as the mechanism of damage. She felt something cold and very clear settle through her. Not anger, not grief. Strategy. She looked at Draven. He looked at her. The moment lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Don't go anywhere, she said. He frowned. I'm the king. I know what you are. She set her pack down on the yard stones. I'm telling you, don't go anywhere until I know exactly what Valicrest has and exactly who helped him get it. Her voice was level and direct and entirely without the quality of a guard speaking to an alpha. It was the voice of someone who had been a princess before she was anything else and had never entirely stopped. Trust me with one morning. Draven looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had no category for. One morning, he said, and somewhere above them in the western corridor, Theron Valicrest was walking through the king's fortress, carrying a forged seal and a careful plan, and he had no idea that the woman he had spent 2 years underestimating had just unpacked her travel bag and was about to remind him exactly what it meant to be a wolf who had forgotten which bloodline they'd decided to betray. The pack sat on the yardstones where she'd left it, and Seraphine stood over it for exactly 3 seconds before she picked it back up and handed it to Mira. Stable it in the secondary stall, she said, not the main rack. Mira took it without comment, which was one of the things Seraphine valued most about her. Draven was watching her with that still, controlled quality he had, the one she had spent 2 years cataloging from a careful distance, and was now standing close enough to feel his actual pressure in the air between them. He hadn't moved since she'd told him to stay put. She noted that. A man who commanded every wolf in 4 kingdoms had stood in a cold yard and waited because she'd asked him to, and she wasn't going to waste the information that contained. Walk with me, she said. Not as king. Don't announce. Don't summon anyone. You're giving me instructions, he said. Yes. In my own fortress. Do you want to know what Valicrest has, or do you want to argue about the yard? He walked with her. She took them through the back corridor along the east wall, the same one she'd stood in on her birthday, and heard her life described as a convenience. She walked it now with different weight. The plaster gap was still there. The stone partition still imperfect. She put her hand against it as she passed and didn't stop. The seal, she said, keeping her voice low and even. How many people had access to your private correspondence mark? 3. My chancellor, my senior officer, and my personal aide. His voice matched hers, the instinctive tactical tone of someone who understood this conversation's requirements without being told. All vetted, all long-standing. Celine Veyer had 2 private evening audiences with you. He was quiet for a step. Yes. Were they your arrangement or her request? Another step. Her request. Through the Chancellor, which means the Chancellor admitted her. Yes. Seraphine stopped at the corridor's far end where the passage split toward the upper hall. She turned to face him and said directly, "Is there anything between you and Celine Veyer that I need to know before I walk into that council room?" Draven looked at her with an expression that moved through several things very quickly and landed on something flat and certain. No. I need more than no. She requested the audiences to discuss her father's trade position in the Northern Coalition. I met with her because the meetings were legitimate and brief, and I had no reason to refuse. His eyes didn't move from hers. I have given her nothing. Not attention, not correspondence, not my private seal. But she had it. She had access to someone who did. They looked at each other in the dim corridor light. "Your Chancellor," Seraphine said, "or was made to look like my Chancellor." He said it with the particular flatness of a man who has begun running the geometry of a trap and doesn't like where the lines are pointing. Valicrest has connections in the Southern Coalition. He's been building them since before I was aware of him as a relevant actor. He became aware of you through me, Seraphine said. She said it without apology, without self-recrimination, just as a fact placed cleanly on the table between them. For 2 years, I was the reason he had reason to study your patterns. That's on me. I'm using it now. Draven said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality, something she hadn't heard from him before, almost careful. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Valicrest came here with a plan that depends on me being absent from this conversation. She met his eyes. He spent 2 years assuming I was decorative. He told a room full of people I was manageable. He came into your fortress with forged correspondence because he believes the woman he used for 2 years left on the pre-dawn rider and is currently 2 hours north on the mountain road. She paused. He doesn't know I'm still here. Draven's expression shifted. Not much. But she had learned to read the small register of his face, and what moved across it now was something she would describe, if pressed, as the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to be surprised by someone and has finally been surprised. You want to let him open the council session, he said. I want to let him open it, make his case, and name me. And then I walk in. The silence that followed had a different texture than their usual silences. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of the same decision from different sides of it, finding that the edges matched. He'll have the letter, Draven said. Whatever Celine staged, he'll present it as genuine. I know. The council will see it. Good. She held his gaze. Let them see it. Let them see exactly what it says and exactly what it implies, and then let them see me standing in that room with my actual name, my actual bloodline, and 2 years of service record in this fortress, and let's find out which one of those things carries more weight in front of a full council. Draven studied her. You're going to declare yourself. I was always going to declare myself, she said. I just planned to do it 300 miles from here. She felt the decision settle into her the way decisions settled when they were right ones. Not comfortably, but solidly, like stone finding its level. Valicrest changed the timeline. That's not his advantage, that's his mistake. Another beat of silence. Then Draven said, I need to tell you something about the council. Tell me. Lord Marin is on it. He sits Eastern Trade. He has existing allegiances to Valicrest's Southern Coalition. His voice was precise. He'll push whatever narrative Valicrest presents. He's been looking for a mechanism to challenge the Northern Alliance arrangement for 2 years. Because the Northern Alliance cuts his trade margins by 30%. Then he'll push hard. She thought for a moment. Who else? Commander Reth is mine. Aldous Fenner is neutral but reads evidence literally. Give him a documented fact and he'll defend it against argument all day. His eyes were steady. Lady Corvin sits Western Territories. She has no stake in the trade question, but she's meticulous about procedural legitimacy. If your claim is cleanly presented, she'll hold the line against theatrics. Seraphine filed all of it. 2 years in a fortress had taught her that the council chamber was just another kind of training yard. Same stakes, different weapons. Who runs the session? I do. Then run it slow, she said. Give Valicrest the rope. The corner of his mouth moved. Understood. She was already turning when he said her name again. Not a command, not a summons, just her name and his voice, which she was going to have to deal with eventually, but not now. She stopped, waited. When this is over, he said, we finish the conversation we were having in the yard. She didn't turn back. Yes, she said. We will. She found Mira on the upper walkway and talked fast and quiet for 4 minutes. Mira listened with the expression of a woman who had been a soldier for 18 years and understood that certain mornings required a different set of preparations than others. When Seraphine finished, Mira said one thing. Your good jacket's still in the secondary chest. I never moved it. I know you didn't. Put it on before you go in. Seraphine looked at her. You're not walking in there as a guard, Mira said, with the flat certainty of someone stating a structural fact. Dress like what you're about to tell them you are. She was right. Seraphine went to the secondary chest. The jacket was a deep charcoal wool, with the close tailoring she'd had made in her first month at Drenmore before she'd fully committed to invisibility, when she had still dressed on instinct. She hadn't worn it in 18 months. She put it on over clean leathers, checked her collar, and looked at the result with the unsentimental assessment of a woman who understood that presentation was a tool and tools existed to be used. She looked like herself. She hadn't looked like herself in 2 years. She stood outside the council hall for one breath, long, measured, drawn from the bottom of the lungs, the way the old weapons master at her father's court had taught her, before she was old enough to understand why controlled breathing mattered in high-stakes rooms. She heard Theron's voice inside, already moving through the cadence of a prepared presentation, and she heard the council's questions beneath it, and she heard the quality of the room's attention, which was the particular sharp silence of people hearing something they believe is significant. She opened the door and walked in. The room was 12 people at a long stone table. Draven at the head. Lord Merrin to the left, already leaning forward with the posture of a man whose argument has been going well. Commander Reth to the right. Lady Corvin at the far end, hands folded, face perfectly neutral. Theron standing at the table's midpoint with a document in his hand and an expression that belonged to the last 3 seconds of a speech he had rehearsed for longer than that. He looked up when the door opened. Every person in the room looked up. Seraphine walked to the open chair across from Theron, pulled it out, and sat down. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. She set her hands flat on the table surface and looked at Theron Valicrest with the direct, level attention of a woman who had spent 24 years learning exactly how much she could endure and had recently finished recalibrating the number upward. The room was absolutely silent. Theron's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the document in his hand and then back at her, and she could see precisely the internal recalculation happening behind his eyes. The version of this scene he had prepared, the one that depended on her absence, dismantling in real time against the actual version, which was her face, present, composed, looking at him without flinching. Marquis Valicrest, Draven said from the head of the table, his voice carrying the complete unhurried authority of a man whose environment this was. You were presenting a claim of improper correspondence. Please continue. The room waited. Theron looked at the document, looked at Seraphine. The correspondence in question references a guard of this fortress. His voice had lost its earlier momentum. He was rebuilding it in real time, and she could hear the construction effort. A woman currently in this room, who I believed— I'm sorry, Seraphine said. Her voice was clear and even and filled the room without effort. Did you not know I was still in Drenmore, Theron? The use of his given name in this formal context was a choice. It landed exactly where she intended it. Merrin looked between them. Corvin's hands stayed folded. Reth was watching Draven. The document, Theron said, recovering. He placed it on the table. Bears the king's private seal. It details arrangements. May I see it? Seraphine said. Silence. This is a council session, Merrin said sharply. You're a guard. You don't have standing to— Lord Merrin, Draven's voice was quiet. Let her see it. Merrin sat back. Something moved across his face that was not quite obedience and not quite defiance, and landed under the king's eye in compliance. Seraphine picked up the document. Read it. Set it down with the careful movements of someone who has found exactly what they expected and is not going to give the room the performance of surprise. This letter, she said, references my bloodline. It implies, Theron said, back on firmer ground, an unauthorized private arrangement between the crown and a member of the guard whose identity was being my bloodline, she said again. She looked up from the document to the room. The letter references the Vale bloodline, which is mine. She held the council's collective attention with the ease of a woman who had grown up in a room exactly like this one, smaller, her father's court, but built on the same architecture of power and assessment and the measured deployment of information. My name is Seraphine Vale. I am the daughter of King Aldrich Vale of the Southern Highland Territories and the acknowledged heir of the oldest wolf bloodline in the Eastern Coalition. She paused and let that sit. I have been stationed in this fortress for 2 years under an assumed posting. The king was aware of my identity and chose not to disclose it at my explicit request, which is his right under the guest rights provision of the Northern Compact. She turned to look at Theron directly. Whatever this document implies, it was written by someone who knew my bloodline and needed it to appear compromising. I'd like to know who told you about this letter. Theron's jaw worked. I received it through... Who? She said. The room was very still. Through a mutual contact, he said. A mutual contact. She tilted her head slightly. Celine Veyer is in this fortress. She's been here for 3 weeks. She has had 2 private evening audiences with the king, the content of which I'd imagine she described to you rather differently than they actually occurred. She watched his face. She watched the precise moment when he understood she had already mapped his structure. You came in here thinking I was gone. You came in here thinking you had a clean line between a forged letter and an absent woman whose testimony couldn't counter yours. She kept her voice entirely even. I'm not absent. The seal is genuine, Marin said, leaning forward. The king's private mark. Then the king should speak to the seal, Seraphine said. All eyes went to Draven. He let the moment hold for exactly as long as it needed to. Then, the seal was accessed without my authorization. I have not issued any private correspondence regarding the Vale bloodline or any informal arrangement with a member of this garrison. The letter is a fabrication. His voice carried no heat. It didn't need to. The question before this council is not the letter's content. The question is how the seal was accessed and who provided Marquis Valacrest with a forged document bearing my private mark, which is a matter of high treason under the Fortress Compact. The word treason changed the temperature of the room. Marin sat back slowly. Corvin unfolded her hands. Theron's face had gone a particular color, the color of a man whose offensive strategy has just been reclassified as a liability. The mutual contact, Seraphine said, not releasing him. Celine Veyer accessed the Chancellor's records and provided you with a fabricated letter. You came here to present it against a woman you believed had already left. She held his gaze across the table. When did you find out who I actually was? The silence stretched. She told me, he said. His voice had dropped, gone quieter. The performance register had collapsed entirely, and what was underneath it was something she recognized. A man who understood he has overplayed a hand he thought was stronger than it was, standing on the wrong side of his own move. When? 2 weeks ago. His eyes moved away from hers briefly, the involuntary deflection of someone confronting a truth they've been managing. She told me your name, your bloodline, said the king was trying to arrange an alliance quietly, said if I brought the letter forward before the formal announcement, it would... He stopped. It would invalidate the alliance, Seraphine finished, because improper contact between the crown and a foreign royal traveling without diplomatic status would violate the Northern Compact's protocol provisions. It would require formal investigation. It would delay the alliance arrangement by at least 2 seasons. She paused. Enough time for Lord Marin's trade position to stabilize and the Southern Coalition to reinforce. She looked at Marin, whose suggestion was it to bring Celine Veyer to Drenmore. Marin's face was stone. Lord Marin, Draven said quietly. The question was asked. The room waited. What happened next happened fast. Marin pushed back from the table, not to flee. He He wasn't that kind of man, but with the momentum of a man who has decided that the best remaining position is a fence. The alliance is ill-advised, he said, his voice hard. A private arrangement between the crown and an unregistered foreign bloodline conducted without council knowledge is exactly the kind of— It isn't private any longer, Draven said. He looked at Seraphine for one moment, one direct, clear moment of communication that crossed the full length of the table between them and required no words, and then looked back at the council. The alliance between the Crown of Drenmore and the Vale bloodline of the Southern Highland Territories will be formally registered with the Council by end of week. The terms are straightforward. The arrangement is clean. His voice dropped to its lowest, flattest register. And anyone in this room who participated in a scheme to fabricate royal correspondence will answer for it before the week is out. Merrin sat very still. Corvin said, quietly and precisely, I move that the document be referred for formal authentication and that Lord Merrin's involvement be investigated under Compact Provision 12. Seconded, Reth said. Theron was still standing at the table's midpoint. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with posture. He was still standing straight, still dressed well, still presenting the exterior of a man with standing. But something had gone out of him in the last 10 minutes. The way heat goes out of a room when the fire is taken. He looked at Seraphine with an expression she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely categorize. Not anger, not calculation. Something older and less managed. You were always this, he said. Not accusing, almost wondering. Yes, she said simply. He nodded once, looked at the document on the table. Then he looked at Draven. The letter came through me. The seal access came through Vare. I had no contact with Lord Merrin directly. His voice was flat and entirely without the warmth she had once found compelling. I'll make a full account to the council. She had not expected that. She sat with it for a moment, recalibrating. Draven was watching Theron with the expression of a man who has just seen something he hadn't fully anticipated and is filing it carefully. The council session closed within the hour. Formal processes were initiated. Merrin submitted to investigation with the still contained fury of a man who knows his position is compromised but has lawyers and will use them. Corvin took custody of the document. Reth arranged Theron's formal deposition. Seraphine walked out of the council hall into the corridor and stood against the wall and took 3 slow breaths in the way that meant she was not going to let the physical response catch her, the one that had been building for the last 40 minutes, while she sat across from her own past with a document between them and spoke in the measured voice of someone who had never once lost their footing. She heard his boots before she saw him. Draven came out of the council hall and looked at her against the wall with both hands braced on the stone and her head tipped back, and she straightened when she saw him and found she couldn't entirely reconstruct the composed exterior. It had held where it needed to hold. It didn't owe her anything beyond that. You're all right, he said. Not a question, more like a checkpoint. Yes. He stood in front of her in the corridor with 2 feet between them and the morning light coming through the slit windows, and she looked at him directly because she was done with looking at him from careful distances. The formal registration, she said. End of week. My father will need to be informed. I'll send a rider today. He'll want to be present for the announcement. Yes. A pause. Will you? She looked at him. Will I what? Be present for the announcement. He held her gaze with the particular directness she had cataloged for 2 years and was now reading without the distance that had made cataloging necessary. Or will you have decided by end of week that the announcement is something that happens to you rather than something you choose? She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about what he had said in the yard, long before politics, long before destiny. She thought about the morning she had packed a bag and turned her back on 2 years of quiet living and had been, for exactly as long as it had taken him to say her name across a cold training ground, entirely certain she was leaving. She said, I choose it. Something shifted in his face. Before either of them could speak again, running footsteps. Mira appeared at the corridor's far end with her expression set to the particular sharp focus that meant this was not an interruption she had chosen to make. The Chancellor, she said, stopping in front of them, breathing hard. He's gone. Draven's jaw tightened. What do you mean, gone? His quarters are empty. His riding horse is gone from the stable. She looked between them. He cleared out in the night. Someone warned him. Her eyes went to Seraphine with a weight in them that was not accusation, but was also not nothing. And there's a second thing. Say it, Draven said. Celine Veyer was found in the king's private chambers an hour ago. Mira's voice was entirely flat. The king's celebration wine from last night was still on the table. The attending physician has been called. Her jaw moved. The king's aide found her there at dawn, my lord. She was alone. She looked directly at Draven. The wine has already been sent for testing. The corridor went very still. Seraphine looked at Draven. He looked at her. In his eyes she saw the exact shape of it. The staged scene, the missing chancellor who had provided access, the wine that had been poured at a celebration she had not attended because she had been packing her bags in a barracks room, and the woman who had spent 3 weeks building a path to this precise moment. In his eyes, she also saw something else, the beginning of what a framed man looked like from the inside. And across the corridor wall, faint but carrying clearly in the morning silence, she heard boots. Multiple sets, measured, deliberate, moving toward them from the direction of the formal guest quarters, and she recognized the pace of wolves who had been given authorization to move. Someone had already called for the king, and whoever had called them had done it before the physician's report was complete. 4 wolves in formal garrison colors, the deep gray and black of Drenmore's internal security unit, not the regular watch rotation. Seraphine registered that distinction in the half-second before they came fully into view. Regular watch carried single blade at the hip. Internal security carried paired short blades and the particular set of their shoulders that came from training designed specifically for enclosed spaces and resistant subjects. Someone had sent the right unit. The lead wolf looked at Draven, then at Seraphine, then back at Draven with the expression of a man who had been given an order he understood but wished he hadn't been given. My lord, he said. His voice was flat and careful. There's been a formal complaint lodged with the senior council. Under Compact Provision 9, we're required to— Who lodged it? Draven said. Lord Marin, my lord, in conjunction with 3 secondary signatories. The lead wolf held a sealed document at his side, not raised, not threatening, just present. The complaint alleges improper conduct in the king's private chambers and requests a formal hold on all relevant parties pending investigation. All relevant parties. Seraphine felt the shape of it complete itself in her chest like a lock finding its mechanism. Marin had moved faster than she had calculated. While she had been in the council hall dismantling Theron's presentation, Marin had been filing paperwork, and the paperwork had been ready, which meant it had been prepared before the council session opened, which meant the session itself had been a distraction. Not Valicrest's move. Marin's. Theron had been the visible piece. Marin was the board. Draven took 1 step forward, not aggressive, not retreating, the step of a man establishing physical fact. I am the king of this fortress, he said. Provision 9 requires council majority for a hold on the crown. 3 signatories plus Marin is 4, my lord. The lead wolf's voice didn't waver. Provision 9 requires 4. The corridor was entirely silent. Mira had gone very still beside Seraphine with the stillness of a soldier calculating the distance between herself and the nearest exit and finding it insufficient. Seraphine was doing the same calculation and arriving at the same answer and moving past it to the next question, which was not how to leave, but what leaving would cost. If Draven was held pending investigation, the Alliance announcement couldn't proceed. The formal registration Draven had promised by end of week required the king's uncontested authority. A hold suspended that authority. 2 seasons minimum for investigation. Marin's trade margins stabilize. The Southern Coalition reinforces. And somewhere in a fortress guest room, Celine Veyer sat in a staged scene that the physician had been called to document. Seraphine looked at Draven. He was looking at the lead wolf with the expression she had learned to read, as the one he wore when he was making a decision that would have consequences he was already measuring. His jaw was set. The muscle in it moved once. My lord, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. Don't. He looked at her. Don't fight this in the corridor, she said. Not here. She watched him hold the thing he wanted to do, which was resist, which was the response of every dominant wolf she had ever known when cornered, because resistance was wired in before strategy, before survival, before anything else. She watched him hold it and set it down. I'll cooperate with the formal process, he said to the lead wolf, loudly enough for the corridor to carry it. Under protest and with my personal advocate present. Understood, my lord. Commander Reth is my advocate. Yes, my lord. They took him, not roughly, with the careful, impersonal precision of men who understood what they were doing and wanted no excess attached to it. Draven walked between them with the composure of a man who had decided the next battlefield was not this hallway, and he didn't look back. And Seraphine stood in the corridor and watched him go with her hands at her sides and her breathing controlled and something cold and structural settling through her that was not panic and was not grief, but was the particular quality of understanding that comes when the full scope of a trap reveals itself at once. Mira appeared at her elbow. What do we do? Seraphine looked at the empty corridor where Draven had been. Marin had 4 signatories ready, she said. That means he had 3 allies willing to sign a formal complaint against the king, inside this fortress, inside the council. Reth won't move against him. No, Corvin won't either, she thought. Which means Marin had 3 names from somewhere outside the standard council composition. Guest signatories, temporary council access. She looked at Mira. Who else came in with Valicrest's Southern Riders last night? Mira's expression changed. I didn't run the full manifest. Run it now. Mira moved. Seraphine stood alone in the corridor for 30 seconds and did the thing she had trained herself to do in moments that required it, which was to stop feeling the situation and start reading it. Feeling came later. In her experience, later was always available. The present moment was not. The wine, the chambers, the chancellor who had cleared out in the night, Celine who had been found at dawn, the formal complaint that was ready before the council session concluded. None of this was spontaneous. This had been built over weeks, maybe months, and the building had required information she hadn't known Marin possessed. Her bloodline, her presence in Drenmore, the timing of the Alliance response, the king's private correspondence seal. Someone inside Drenmore's inner circle had been feeding Marin information for longer than Celine Vare had been in the fortress. The Chancellor had run before anyone could question him. She pushed off the wall and moved. The physician's name was Aldrin Koss, a compact she-wolf in her 50s who had served Drenmore's garrison for a decade and a half and possessed the unsentimental precision of someone who had treated enough injuries and illnesses to have lost interest in drama entirely. Seraphine found her in the corridor outside the king's private chambers, writing in a leather-bound record with the focused attention of a woman who believed documentation was the only thing standing between order and chaos. The wine, Seraphine said. Koss looked up, looked at Seraphine's jacket. Your veil. Yes. You're not officially cleared to receive this report. I know. Seraphine held her gaze. Tell me anyway. Koss considered her for a moment with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether a shortcut is worth the paperwork it creates. Then she looked back at her notes. The wine contained a sedative compound, derivative of nightroot, which is a mountain source plant available in the northern highlands and occasionally traded through the eastern corridor markets. Not poison, not lethal, designed to produce extended unconsciousness and, in some subjects, significant confusion upon waking. She paused. The king's cup showed higher concentration than the general table service. Whoever administered it targeted his specific cup. The aide who found Lady Vare, Seraphine said, was his account documented. He found the door unlocked at dawn. Lady Vare was seated in the chair beside the cold fireplace. The king's celebration cup was on the table. She appeared distressed. Koss's voice was entirely flat. The aide's account is that he immediately secured the room and called for me. Lady Vare's condition. Unaffected by the compound, she hadn't consumed from the king's cup. No, Seraphine said quietly. She hadn't. Koss looked at her, said nothing. The aide who secured the room, Seraphine said. Name. Torvek. He's been the king's personal aide for 3 years, I know. Seraphine had seen him 100 times. He was young, efficient, unremarkable in the way that unremarkable people sometimes deliberately are. She thought about the Chancellor's empty quarters. She thought about the pre-prepared complaint in Marin's possession. She thought about the information chain that had to exist for all of this to work. Bloodline, timing, seal access, chamber access, and she thought about who sat at the intersection of all of it, and the answer landed in her chest with the quiet certainty of something she should have mapped earlier. Not the Chancellor, the aide. The Chancellor had provided seal access because the aide had fed him the framing. The aide had unlocked the chamber. The aide had called for the physician at the precise moment that best served the staged scene. The aide had filed the discovery report that Marin had used as the documented basis for his formal complaint. 3 years in the king's service. Long enough to become furniture. Long enough to know every pattern, every lock, every ceremony the king attended, and what he drank at them. She was moving before she finished the thought. She found Torvek in the administrative corridor, which should have been her first indicator that something was wrong. The king's personal aide had no business in the administrative corridor, while his king was being held under formal process. He was moving quickly toward the records room with a satchel under his arm, and the careful pace of someone who wants to look purposeful rather than urgent. "Torvek," she said. He turned, looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that lasted less than a second before he reconstructed the neutral expression of a long-serving aide. "Lady Vale," he said. The title landed wrong. She had not been publicly named in any interaction he should have been present for. The council session had been closed. The corridor conversation with Draven and Mira had been private. He knew her name. She looked at the satchel. He looked at the satchel. They looked at each other. She said, "What's in the bag?" "Administrative records. Routine transfer, while the king is—" "Put it down." His mouth tightened. "You don't have authority to—" "Put it down, Torvek." He ran. She was faster. 2 years of pre-dawn training in a yard before the birds arrived, and she was across the corridor in 3 strides, and she caught the satchel strap as he turned, and the pull spun him half around and the contents scattered. She saw what hit the floor immediately. The leather correspondence folio stamped with the king's private administrative mark, the kind used to transfer sensitive records, the kind that required personal aid authorization to access. Inside the folio, in the half-second before he scrambled for it, she saw handwriting she recognized. Not Draven's, Marin's. A record of payments, quarterly. 3 years of quarterly notations in Lord Marin's precise accounting hand, and beside each one, a single initial. T. She picked it up. Torvek went very still on the floor where he'd fallen, reaching for it. She looked at the notations, looked at him. 3 years, she said. He said nothing. The Chancellor didn't act alone. She held the folio. He provided seal access because you told him it was required for a legitimate administrative process. The celebration wine. You poured the king's cup. She watched his face. The chamber door. You left it unlocked. She kept her voice even because the evenness was not effort now. It was the natural quality of something that has gone past the temperature of heat into something colder and more absolute. You called for the physician at the time Marin needed you to call. Torvek was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been caught at the bottom of a hand. He thought he'd played perfectly and is recalibrating what his options are. The king was going to dismantle Marin's entire trade network, he said finally. The alliance would have— I know what the alliance would have done. She looked at him with full, direct attention. I don't need your reasoning. She took the folio and walked. She got 20 feet before she understood it wasn't going to be enough. Marin had 4 signatories. Even with the folio, even with Torvek's testimony under formal process, the investigation would take days. The alliance announcement was suspended. Draven was held. And in a guest room somewhere in Drenmore's upper quarters, Celine Veyer was sitting with 2 attorneys from the Southern Coalition who had arrived with Valacrest riders and had been waiting quietly this entire time for exactly this moment. The trap had 3 stages. The council session was stage 1. The formal hold was stage 2. Stage 3 was a formal petition to the Northern Coalition Council, not Drenmore's internal council, but the full multi-kingdom body that governed compact disputes, requesting a ruling on the validity of any alliance formed under disputed conditions. If that petition filed before the alliance was formally registered, it could suspend the arrangement for a full review cycle. 18 months minimum. She knew this because it was what she would have done. She found Mira at the bottom of the east stairwell and showed her the folio in 3 seconds. Mira read fast, looked up. Reth needs this immediately. Yes, take it. She was already thinking forward. What's Corvin's position? She's in the upper records room. She's been reviewing the compact provisions since the council session closed. She's not neutral anymore. She's angry. Someone used her motion to legitimize a hold she didn't know was coming. She'll move if she has documented evidence. She'll move faster than Reth. Mira was already moving. She stopped, turned back. Where are you going? Seraphine said. To finish this. The guest corridor on the upper floor was quiet. It was always quiet. The upper floor was for visiting dignitaries and high-ranking guests, people who generated their own silence through status. Seraphine walked it with her footsteps deliberately audible, not sneaking, not performing anything other than a woman with a destination. She knocked on Celine Veyer's door once. The attorney who opened it was a compact man in travel clothes who looked at her with the immediate calculation of a professional and said, Lady Veyer is not receiving. She'll receive me. I'm afraid that's not. Tell her Seraphine Vale is at the door. She held his gaze. Tell her exactly that. He closed the door. 30 seconds of silence. It opened again. Celine was seated by the window with the composed elegance of a woman who had been expecting a visit and had prepared the composition of her own presence for it. She wore pale blue, her fair hair dressed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a portrait of someone who had done nothing. The attorney remained by the door. Celine's personal maid stood near the inner doorway. Close the door, Seraphine said to the attorney. Stand outside it. I'm Lady Veyer's legal representative, and I have the right to... Close the door. He looked at Celine. Celine gave a small, precise nod. He closed the door. They were alone. Celine looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has designed a game and is watching a piece move in a direction that is either unexpected or exactly what she planned and is not yet showing which. You're still here, she said. Yes. I thought you'd left. I did too. Seraphine remained standing. She had chosen not to sit because she wanted the geometry of this room to remain clear, and she wanted Celine to understand from the first moment that nothing here was social. The petition to the Northern Coalition Council, she said. When does it file? Something flickered in Celine's face. Small, quick. I don't know what you're... When? Silence. Tomorrow morning, Celine said. Her voice had lost the composed warmth and found something more direct beneath it. The attorney files at first bell. On what grounds? Disputed formation conditions. She tilted her head slightly. An alliance arranged in private between a king under investigation and a foreign royal who entered the territory without diplomatic registration. The Coalition Council will have no choice but to review. The investigation was manufactured, Seraphine said. That will take time to prove. I have the aide's financial record. Celine's jaw moved. Very small. The petition still files. Even if the investigation is later cleared, the review cycle. I know the review cycle, Seraphine said. You've thought this through very well. She looked at Celine directly and found she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not anger and not contempt, but something closer to recognition. The particular recognition of a woman looking at another woman who made an entirely different set of choices in an entirely similar set of circumstances. Marin promised you what exactly for this? Celine was quiet for a moment. The queen position, she said finally. When the king's current arrangement was dissolved and the alliance voided, the crown would need a new match. My father's territories cover the Eastern Highland approach. Strategically necessary. So Marin offered you a crown in exchange for the king's integrity. Marin offered me a future, Celine said, and her voice had an edge in it now that was less composed and more raw. Do you know what it is to spend 28 years being strategically relevant and never once the primary choice? To have every conversation be about what your father's territory provides rather than what you are? She looked at Seraphine with the unguarded directness of someone who has stopped performing and found, beneath the performance, genuine grievance. You disappeared for 2 years and came back, and he sent an alliance response in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Do you understand how long other women have been waiting? The room held that. Seraphine understood. She understood it in her bones, the way she understood everything that had shaped her before she was old enough to name it. She had run from a throne because she refused to be used. Celine had reached for one because she refused to keep waiting. Different roads, same terrain. She did not let that understanding soften what needed to happen. The petition can't file, she said. You can't stop it. I can file first. She kept her voice level. A formal declaration of diplomatic status, registered under my bloodline's compact standing, filed before first bell. It establishes retroactive diplomatic registration from the date I entered Drenmore's territory, which closes the disputed formation argument entirely. She paused. Your attorney knows that. Ask him. Celine looked at her. The investigation of Draven still proceeds, Seraphine said. I can't stop that process from inside, and I wouldn't try. But the folio I'm currently holding goes to Commander Reth and Lady Corvin within the hour, and Torvek will give a full account because the alternative for him is a treason charge, and he's not a man who dies for causes. The investigation collapses before the weekends. She tilted her head. And when it does, the king's first act will be to review every compact arrangement made through his chancellor's office in the past 3 years. The color in Celine's face did something careful. Marin's trade arrangements will not survive that review, Seraphine said quietly, which means the promise he made you is already gone. It was gone before I walked in this door. She let that sit. I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you because whatever you choose to do next, choose it with accurate information. You've had enough decisions made for you already. She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, Celine said, He did watch you, you know. She stopped. The entire time you were here. Every morning in the yard, every assignment, every time you stood in a room, I watched him watch you and not look away. Her voice was entirely quiet now, stripped of strategy. I thought if I removed you from the situation, it would change, but you can't remove a fixed point. I should have understood that earlier. Seraphine stood at the door for a moment, with her hand on the frame and the corridor light ahead of her and Celine's voice behind her. She said, File what you need to file. She opened the door. Her own declaration was registered with the Fortress Records Office at the 43rd minute of the second hour, witnessed by Lady Corvin, who had arrived with Mira and a face like cold iron. Reth received the folio. Torvek, offered the choice between formal confession and a treason proceeding, chose the confession within 20 minutes. She was standing at the records office window looking out at the training yard she had run every morning for 2 years when Mira appeared at the doorway and said quietly, The king has been released pending formal review. Seraphine exhaled. Lady Corvin moved, Mira said, the moment Reth filed the folio as evidence. She pulled the Provision 9 hold on the grounds of tainted complaint process. She paused. Marin is in the East Wing under his own informal restraint. He won't move against the king again today. No, Seraphine said. He won't. She turned from the window. She had won the morning. She understood that. The folio, the diplomatic registration, Torvek's confession, Corvin's motion, they had collectively dismantled enough of the trap structure to free the king and preserve the alliance's formation timeline. But the footwork wasn't finished. Marin was restrained, not removed. The Southern Coalition's attorneys were still in the fortress. Theron's account was given, but his credibility was permanently compromised in ways that meant he had nothing left to lose. And unpredictable people with nothing to lose were a specific category of risk. And somewhere in this fortress was a chancellor who had ridden out before dawn with a full working knowledge of Drenmore's internal correspondence systems. She thought about the old weapons master who had taught her how to breathe before high-stakes rooms. He had also taught her something else, a lesson she had resisted for years because it required a quality she'd found easier to avoid than to develop. He had said, "The woman who survives alone is capable. The woman who knows which walls to put her back against and whose hand to take in the dark, she is formidable. She had spent 2 years being capable. She walked toward the east corridor. She was 3 steps from the turn toward the holding rooms when she saw him. Draven was standing at the far end of the corridor. He had clearly come directly from wherever they had held him. His collar was open. His expression was the expression of a man who had spent 2 hours in a room being formally processed and had maintained his composure for every second of it by sheer trained will. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, not composed but honest, stripped of the particular control that came from never being caught without a defense. He looked like a man who had just understood something. She walked toward him. They met in the middle of the corridor and stood 2 feet apart in the way they kept standing 2 feet apart, and she looked at him directly. He said, "The diplomatic registration." "Yes." "The folio." "Mira has a copy. Reth has the original." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him hold very still around something large and not entirely containable. "You held this together," he said. "We held it together." She paused. "The Chancellor is still loose." "I know." "Marin's network extends past this fortress. Today buys time. It doesn't end it." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "Seraphine." She waited. "What I told you in the yard," he said, "before all of this. I need you to know it wasn't—" And that was when the window at the corridor's end exploded inward. Not a weapon. Not glass. The inner windows were stone-framed without panes. What came through was a message, literally, a weighted message cylinder of the kind used for long-distance compact correspondence, fired at high velocity from a handheld launcher of the type she had seen in the Southern Coalition's military catalog. It clattered to the floor between them. Draven picked it up before she could reach it. He broke the seal. He read it. She watched his face do something she had never seen it do. Not the muscle in the jaw. Not the controlled flatness. Something behind his eyes that was older than any of the expressions she had cataloged. The look of a man reading a fact that changes the fundamental shape of the situation he thought he was standing in. He handed it to her without a word. She read it. The message was from the Northern Coalition Council, not Drenmore's internal council. The full body. It bore 5 seals. It stated in the compact's formal language that a petition had been received and granted emergency review status. Not Celine's petition, that had never filed. Something older. Something that had been in process before any of them arrived at this morning. A petition from Lord Marin, filed 6 weeks prior, requesting a formal compact review of the Vale bloodline's standing eligibility for Northern Alliance formation on the grounds of undisclosed abandonment of the Southern Highland throne. Not a fabrication, not a staged document, a real petition, properly filed, properly reviewed, and now formally answered. The Northern Coalition Council had ruled. Until the question of Seraphine's status as legitimate Vale heir was resolved by her father's court, not assumed, not implied, but formally adjudicated under Highland Compact law, she could not be party to any binding Northern Alliance arrangement. She was not valid. She was suspended. She looked up from the document and found Draven looking at her with the expression she had no category for, the one she had decided she would deal with later, and understood that later had arrived and brought everything with it. "Your father," he said quietly. "Yes." Her voice was steady. "I have to go home." He said nothing. "To face it formally." She looked at the document. "To be adjudicated. To stand in my father's court and have my claim to the Vale succession formally declared before the compact witnesses." She paused. "It could take weeks." "I know what it takes." She looked at him. He looked at her. 2 feet of corridor between them and a document in her hand and the full weight of everything she had spent 2 years running from standing directly in her path, not as a threat, but as the only road left. "The morning isn't finished," she said. "No," he said. "It's just changed shape." She exhaled once, slow, from the bottom. She had survived betrayal, a forged letter, a framed king, a 3-stage trap, and a woman who had been waiting 28 years for a different outcome. She had filed documents and walked into rooms and said her own name out loud after 2 years of not saying it, and every single one of those things had required a version of herself she had been building since she was 6 years old, watching a weapons master teach her how to breathe. None of it had prepared her for this. Not the document, for the look on his face, for the understanding that the hardest thing she had ever done was not survive her enemies. It was decide, finally, and without qualification, to stop surviving and start choosing. She folded the document, put it inside her jacket. "Send a rider to my father today," she said. "I'll follow tomorrow at dawn." "I'll ride with you," he said. She looked at him. "You're not doing this alone," he said, simply, without negotiation. She stood in the corridor with the cold morning light coming through the far window and the destroyed glass on the floor and the fortress moving around them with all its noise and process and the machinery of power doing what it always did, grinding forward regardless of what the people inside it needed. And she looked at the Alpha King of Drenmore standing 2 feet away in an open collar with a face that had finally, entirely, stopped being managed. She said, "All right, just that. All right." They rode at dawn. 6 wolves in Drenmore's colors flanking them on the mountain road. Commander Reth's personal selection, not ceremonial guards but field-trained wolves who understood that the distinction between escort and protection mattered and chose the latter. Seraphine rode without armor, which was her preference on open roads where speed served better than steel, and Draven rode beside her in the plain travel coat she was starting to associate with the version of him that existed outside the fortress's architecture of rank and obligation. They didn't speak much for the first 2 hours. The mountain road north demanded attention anyway, narrow in the switchback sections, iced at the higher elevation crossings, the kind of terrain that required a rider to be present in their body rather than their head. Seraphine was grateful for the requirement. Her head was not a comfortable place to spend 2 hours alone. She had sent a message to her father the night before, brief and direct, because her father understood brevity and had always responded better to it than to elaboration. She had told him she was coming. She had told him why. She had not told him that the Alpha King of Drenmore was riding beside her, partly because she hadn't decided how to frame it, and partly because some information landed better in person. She was aware, in the way that had been growing into something she could no longer manage with clinical distance, that Draven had slept somewhere inside Drenmore's walls last night, after 2 hours in a formal holding room and an afternoon of systematic dismantling of a trap built around him by his own trusted aide. She was aware that he had offered, without condition, to ride to her father's court. She was aware that in 2 years of proximity, she had never once seen him offer anything without knowing its weight. The mountain road leveled at the high pass, and the view opened east across the highland valleys, gray and green under a sky that hadn't decided between clearing and closing. Seraphine pulled her horse to the edge of the overlook and looked at it for a long moment. Draven pulled up beside her. "Tell me about your father," he said. She looked at the valleys. "He's a precise man, methodical. He believes preparation is a form of respect." She paused. "He'll have already assembled the compact witnesses. He knew when I sent the message that the adjudication has to happen formally, and he'll have it ready when we arrive." "Is he angry?" She considered that. "No, he was never angry about my leaving. I think he understood why I went. He made choices when I was young that I couldn't live inside, and he knew it, and he let me go." She exhaled slowly. "I think he's been waiting for me to decide to come back rather than be summoned. And now you're coming back." "Because Marin forced my hand." "Is that the only reason?" She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the valleys with the particular attention of a man asking a question he already suspects the answer to and wants confirmed anyway. She found she didn't want to manage this anymore. She had spent 2 years managing everything carefully at a distance, and she had been in 1 day's worth of not doing that, and the air was cleaner. "No," she said. "It's not the only reason." He nodded once, looked at the road ahead. "Then let's go." The Vale Court was 3 hours further on a road that improved after the high pass, flattening into the Highland Valley approach where her father's territory began, announced by the shifting stone, lighter granite, almost gold in certain light, quarried from the local ridges rather than the dark northern rock of Drenmore. Seraphine had grown up with that stone. She had run her hands along those walls at 6 years old, At 12, at 17 the last time she had walked through the main gate. It looked smaller than memory made it and larger than she had let herself think about in 2 years of deliberate not thinking. The gate guards recognized her before she dismounted. She saw it happen. The slight shift, the particular attention of men who know a face they were told to watch for and have been watching for longer than is comfortable. One of them turned toward the gate tower before she reached the courtyard. The message was moving faster than she was. Her father met them in the courtyard. King Aldrich Vale was 61 years old and had the build of a man who had been physically powerful in his youth and had allowed the power to convert, over the decades, into a different kind of weight. The settled, deliberate presence of someone who had long ago stopped needing to demonstrate capability and simply embodied it. He was gray-haired, sharp-eyed, and looking at his daughter with an expression she had not seen from him before and could not immediately classify. His gaze moved to Draven. He took in the plain coat, the road dust, the absence of ceremonial presentation, and his expression shifted into something she recognized as assessment. "Lord Kaelor," he said. "King Vale." Draven dismounted with the ease of a man comfortable in other men's courts and inclined his head with a respect that was genuine rather than performed. Her father looked at that for a moment. Then he looked at Seraphine. "Come inside," he said. The adjudication was held in the formal hall at the second hour of the afternoon. 4 compact witnesses, 2 from the Highland Coalition, 1 from the Eastern Corridor, and Lady Corvin, who had ridden through the night behind them and arrived 40 minutes before the session began, which told Seraphine several things about Lady Corvin's motivations, all of them favorable. The process itself was not complicated. It was thorough. Her father presented the succession documentation, unbroken, going back 3 generations. Seraphine gave her formal statement of identity, confirmed under compact oath, naming her bloodline, her lineage, her deliberate absence and its circumstances, and her formal return to the Vale succession. The witnesses examined the documentation, asked their questions, recorded their findings. At the end, the senior Highland witness looked up from the records and said, with the flat precision of someone closing a procedural matter, "Seraphine Vale is formally declared legitimate heir to the Vale succession under Highland Compact law, with full standing for all alliance formation purposes." She breathed, just that. One full breath, from the bottom. Draven was standing at the hall's edge, not at the table, not as a party to the proceedings, just present, watching. She didn't look at him during the formal statement. Afterwards, in the corridor, while the witnesses completed their documentation, she found him waiting for her. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at him in the corridor light of her father's court and felt the full strange weight of standing in the place she had run from, beside the person she hadn't expected to be standing beside, with a name she had put down and just formally picked back up. 2 days, he said. The formal alliance registration requires the diplomatic filing to be updated with today's adjudication date. 2 days, and the registration is complete. And Marin's petition becomes void. Yes, she nodded, felt something move through her chest that was not quite relief and not quite resolution, but was the closest thing to stillness she had felt since the pre-dawn yard 2 days ago. That was when her father's senior aide appeared at the corridor's end with the expression Seraphine had learned, across 20 years of watching her father's court, to read as the specific expression that meant something had arrived that was not expected and was not welcome. "There's a company," the aide said, "on the southern approach road, compact colors, Northern Coalition Authority." Draven's jaw set. "How many?" Seraphine said. 30 riders. The aide looked between them. "They're carrying enforcement authority. Formal coalition seal. 30 riders with enforcement authority didn't escort documents. They compelled people." She looked at Draven. "Marin." "The petition to the Coalition Council was already in process," he said, his voice gone flat and operational. "Today's adjudication changes the alliance validity question, but it doesn't automatically void a coalition enforcement action already in motion. If Marin filed a supplementary claim, claiming what?" she said. "We have the adjudication, claiming the alliance formation was conducted while the King of Drenmore was under active compact investigation." His jaw was tight. "The investigation was formally closed this morning when Torvik's confession was accepted, But formally closed this morning means it was active yesterday, and the Alliance response was sent while it was active. She stared at him. That's not how the provision works. No, but it's how Marin will argue it. And a coalition enforcement company on the road means someone in the Coalition Council accepted the argument as preliminary grounds for action. He looked at her directly. They're here for me. 30 wolves with enforcement authority. She thought about what that meant. Not arrest, not exactly. The Coalition Compact didn't operate with criminal jurisdiction over member kings. What it meant was compelled attendance at a formal Coalition review session, held in Coalition territory, during which the king's authority to conduct alliance business was suspended. Weeks, possibly months. She thought about the training yard in Drenmore 2 years ago, and all the mornings she had been there before the birds, and she had thought, in the small, honest hours, that survival was the only loyalty she owed herself. She had believed that for a long time. She had built it into the architecture of her days like load-bearing stone. Standing in this corridor, she understood, with the particular clarity of a thing finally seen directly, that she had been half right. Survival was a foundation. But a woman who only built foundations had a floor and no walls and nothing above, and the wind came in from every direction, and she was very good at enduring the wind, and she was so tired of enduring it. Go meet them, she said. Draven looked at her. Go meet them, she said again. Formally. Don't resist the enforcement request. If you resist, it becomes a compact violation, and that's a different process entirely. She was already moving, already thinking forward. Buy me 2 hours. Seraphine. Draven. She said his name with full weight, no distance, the first time she had said it with both of those qualities simultaneously. I need 2 hours. He looked at her for one long second with the expression she had no category for, the one that lived on his face when he stopped being managed. Then he said, 2 hours. He walked toward the gate. She went to find her father. Aldrich Vale was in the records room, which was where he always went when the world moved faster than planning accounted for, because records rooms were where the documented past lived, and the documented past was the only thing that reliably constrained the chaotic present. He was standing at the long table with 3 documents in front of him when she came in. He looked up without surprise. Southern Approach, he said. Yes. Coalition Enforcement. Yes. She stopped at the table across from him. I need the original compact treaty, the founding document, the one you have in the vault. He looked at her steadily. Why? Because the founding compact has a provision that coalition enforcement actions against a member king require unanimous council consent, not majority. She held his gaze. And I want to know who on the coalition council signed the consent for 30 enforcement riders. Her father was quiet for a moment. That provision hasn't been invoked in 40 years. Then it's time. He looked at her with the expression she had waited a long time to see from him. Not the expression of a king managing a political situation, but the expression of a father watching his child and recognizing, finally, the adult his child became in the years they were apart. He went to the vault. The founding compact was on vellum, which aged differently than paper, staying supple where paper became brittle, and it smelled like 40 years of careful storage. She found the provision in the 3rd section, exactly where she remembered it from a childhood of being required to read historical documents as education. Her father stood beside her and read it with her. Unanimous council consent. She looked up. How many are on the current coalition council, she said. 11 members. And the consent document would have to list all 11 signatures. Yes. She straightened. The enforcement company arrived here, in your territory, without notifying you as a Highland Compact member. Her father's expression shifted. No, he said slowly. They didn't notify me. Which is a procedural violation under the Highland Access provision. She was assembling pieces as fast as she could speak them. Marin can't have gotten 11 unanimous signatures in the time between this morning's council session and now. Not legitimately. She paused. Which means the enforcement action is either improperly authorized or the consent was obtained through the same kind of pressure he used in Drenmore. Aldrich Vale looked at his daughter. He said very quietly, What do you need from me? Your formal objection, filed under the Highland Access Provision. It freezes the enforcement action pending procedural review. That review could take days, not weeks, not months. She held his gaze. Days. Which is all I need. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him think, watched the methodical precision of his mind working through the documentation requirements, the compact implications, the political cost of a Highland king formally objecting to a coalition enforcement action. She watched him arrive at the end of it. He sat down and began to write. She was back at the courtyard gate in 40 minutes with a formal objection bearing her father's seal and the Highland Compact's authority, and she arrived to find the enforcement company already in the courtyard. 30 wolves mounted in coalition gray. Their commander was a broad-shouldered man she didn't know, middle-aged, with the set of someone who had done this kind of work many times and found it unremarkable. Draven was standing in the courtyard center with Reth and 2 of the escort wolves flanking him, and he was doing what she had asked, which was not resisting, holding his ground with the composed stillness of a man who had decided the ground was the only thing currently worth holding. The company commander was speaking to him with the formal language of enforcement procedure, and Seraphine walked into the center of the courtyard and handed the commander the document without preamble. He looked at it. Highland formal objection, she said. Filed under Compact Provision 7, Subsection 3, Highland Territorial Access Requirements. The enforcement action is frozen pending procedural review of the authorization consent. She held his gaze. By unanimous consent requirement. The commander read the document with the careful attention of a man who understood that paperwork in this environment was a weapon, and he had just had one placed against his chest. Lady Vale, he said. This doesn't void the enforcement authority. No, she said. It freezes it. Your authority to compel the King of Drenmore requires unanimous council consent, which I'm formally requesting the documentation for. She paused. If you have the documentation, present it and the action proceeds. If you don't, then under Highland Compact law, you're in violation of the access provision and the action is suspended until proper process is completed. Silence in the courtyard. The company commander looked at the document, looked at her, looked at his riders. She watched him do the calculation. 30 wolves, legitimate authority, a straightforward enforcement action, running into a legal mechanism he hadn't prepared for. The calculation had a time component. He could hold position and wait for the Coalition Council to respond to the procedural challenge. He could push forward and create a compact violation that would compromise the entire enforcement action. He could request his own council authorization. He couldn't do any of those things quickly. We'll hold position pending council response, he said finally. Flat, unhappy about it. Thank you, she said. She turned. Draven was looking at her with an expression she recognized now. She had been learning the vocabulary of his face for 2 years, and this expression was the one she had seen briefly in the training yard when she corrected his form. The genuine surprise of a man who is not easily surprised expanded into something larger and less containable. She walked to him and stopped closer than 2 feet, and looked up at him directly. Days, she said. I bought us days. I know what you bought us. His voice was low. Something in it was not entirely controlled. I also know what it cost you, coming back here, doing this publicly, putting your name on documents that can't be walked back. I know what I put my name on. Seraphine. He said her name the way he had said it in the training yard, the way that had moved through her like a sound belonging to her. When this is finished, the registration, the review, all of it, I need to say the things I said in the yard this morning before the window came through. She looked at him. Say them now. The courtyard had 30 wolves in coalition gray standing at its edges, and her father's court watching from the gate, and Commander Reth being professionally very interested in the middle distance. None of it felt like the right setting, and all of it felt completely irrelevant. I've been watching you since your 3rd week in Drenmore, he said, not because you were a foreign royal in my garrison. Before I confirmed that, before I knew your bloodline or your name or anything about you except that you were in my yard before dawn every morning training like the only person who mattered was yourself. And you stood in rooms full of people with more rank than you, and you never once made yourself smaller to fit. And He stopped. Started differently, which was unlike him and which she was beginning to understand meant the restart was always the truer thing. I want you beside me, not for the alliance, not for the bloodline. I want you beside me because you walked into a council room today with a forged letter on the table and you looked at Valacrest across it and you didn't flinch, and I have been looking for someone who doesn't flinch for a very long time, and I am done pretending I haven't found her. The courtyard held its breath. She looked at him, all of him. The open collar, and the road dust, and the jaw that carried its tension, and the eyes that were, in this moment, entirely without armor. She said, I'm going to need you to hold that thought. His expression shifted. What? She looked past him at the gate. A second company of riders had appeared at the Valley Road's turn, a quarter-mile out, moving fast. Not Coalition Gray. Southern Coalition colors sway Marin's regional standard. And they were not 30, they were closer to 60. And riding at their front, she could see from the distance and the specific way he sat a horse, was Lord Marin himself. Not sending a proxy, not working through legal channels, coming in person. With enough wolves to make the formal objection document irrelevant through sheer physical presence if he chose to use them that way, which meant he had decided that the paperwork battle was over, and the next phase of this was something the compact provisions hadn't been designed to handle. She felt Draven go very still beside her. She felt Reth step forward on her other side. She felt the quality of the air in the courtyard change. The particular shift that happened when every wolf in proximity simultaneously made the transition from waiting to ready. The pre-fight stillness that was not quiet at all, but was the loudest thing in any space. She felt her own hands steady at her sides, and her breathing dropped to the low, measured rhythm of a woman who had been taught how to breathe before rooms that could not be walked away from. Lord Marin rode through the valley approach at the head of 60 wolves, and the morning that had started with a document through a window and a ride north and a legal framework painstakingly assembled from compact provisions and historical precedent was about to become something that no document could fully contain. She looked at Draven. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. Marin was 50 yards out, 40. The Coalition Enforcement Company in the courtyard was already shifting, already recalibrating their loyalties in real time, because 30 wolves in a frozen legal action meant one set of calculations, and 60 wolves and a regional lord riding in person meant another, 30 yards. Whatever happens next, Draven said, low and direct for her alone, stay on my left. Not behind him, beside him. She felt that settle through her chest like a key finding a lock it was made for. Always, she said. 20 yards. Marin raised his fist and his company stopped. The silence in the valley was absolute. And into that silence, from somewhere behind the courtyard gate, she heard the sound she had not expected and could not immediately account for. The deep, resonant horn call of the Highland Coalition's formal assembly signal, the one used to summon emergency compact session, the one that required every compact member in range to respond. Her father. Her father, standing at the gate of his court with the founding compact in his hands, and the authority of a Highland king who had decided, finally, and without qualification, that this was the morning he chose his daughter over his neutrality. Marin looked at the gate, looked at Seraphine, looked at Draven, 60 wolves behind him in southern colors, one king with road dust on his coat, one woman who had spent 2 years learning how to disappear and had just spent one morning remembering everything she was. And somewhere in the arithmetic of that standoff, the number that mattered most was not 60 or 30 or 2. It was 1. The founding compact, in her father's hands, requiring unanimous consent that Marin had never obtained. She looked at Marin across 40 yards of Highland courtyard, and she looked at him without flinching, and she watched him understand, in the precise and terrible moment that such understandings arrived, that he had brought 60 wolves to a fight that was going to be decided by a document. She watched him understand it, and she watched him decide he hadn't finished yet. He dismounted and started walking toward them. Marin walked like a man who had already decided the outcome. That was the first thing Seraphine registered. Not the 60 wolves behind him, not the Coalition Enforcement Company recalibrating its loyalties in the courtyard's charged silence. but the quality of his stride. Deliberate, unhurried. The walk of someone who had been building toward this moment for long enough that arriving at it felt like completion rather than risk. She had seen that walk before. She had seen it on men who had confused certainty with invincibility, and she had learned, watching those men, that certainty was a foundation and invincibility was a story, and stories had endings that their tellers didn't always control. Draven didn't move from her left side. That mattered in ways she wasn't going to examine right now. Later. There would be time later to examine all of it. Marin stopped 10 feet from them. He was a broad man, late 50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome in its youth and had converted that handsomeness, over decades, into a kind of commanding bluntness. He looked at Seraphine first, then at Draven, then at the document Aldrich Vale was holding at the gate. "That horn changes nothing," he said. His voice was even, experienced, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in compact politics and understood that tone was its own form of leverage. The founding compact requires unanimous consent for coalition enforcement action against a member king, Seraphine said. You don't have it. I have 11 signatures. Show me the document. His jaw moved. The document is filed with the Coalition Council. Then it's not in your possession. She held his gaze. 11 signatures on a document filed with the Council before this morning's adjudication is completed. My adjudication as legitimate Vale heir, which changes the formation validity argument entirely. She paused. You know this, Lord Marin. You're a precise man. You built a 3-stage trap. You don't make procedural errors by accident. She tilted her head slightly. Which means you're not here for the document argument. You're here because the document argument is finished and you've decided the next move is physical presence. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect and occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. 60 wolves is not a legal argument, he said. No, she said. It isn't. Behind her, she heard Reth's hand move to his blade. Behind Marin, 60 wolves waited. In the courtyard gate, Aldrich Vale stood with the founding compact and the Highland assembly horn and the authority of a man who had made his choice. Seraphine thought about what it meant to stand at the exact intersection of everything that had been moving toward this point for months, years, the full accumulated weight of power and politics, and the private choices of individuals who had never intended to become the hinges on which large things turned. She thought about a weapons master who had taught her how to breathe. She thought about a birthday cake on a corridor floor. She thought about every morning she had stood in a training yard before the birds arrived and built herself into a person who could endure anything alone, and how that building had been necessary, and how it had also been incomplete, and how the incompleteness was not a failure, but a phase. The phase before she was ready to understand that strength was not the same as isolation. She had endured alone. Now she was choosing to stand beside someone. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. She said to Marin, "Call your wolves back." He blinked. "You're not in a position to—" "Call them back," she said again, "or I will formally invoke Highland Compact Emergency Assembly, which my father has already initiated, and every Compact member in Highland territory will be required to respond. That process takes hours, and it freezes all enforcement actions of any kind until the session concludes." She let that sit. "You rode here fast. You brought 60 wolves. You have been running this campaign for 6 weeks minimum. You are tired and you are out of procedural ground, and you came here in person because you have spent 40 years in compact politics, and you understand that sometimes the last move available is to stand in front of something and make it personal." She looked at him directly. "I understand that too. I'm asking you, personally, to stand down." The courtyard was very quiet. Marin looked at her for a long moment. She watched something work through his face, something she had not expected to see there. Something that was not strategic and not political, but older and more human. The expression of a man who has pushed something as far as it can go and has just reached the moment of understanding that further is not a direction that exists anymore. He looked at Draven. "The trade margins," he said. His voice had changed, less performance, more just a man stating a fact. "The Alliance cuts them by 30%. That's not politics. That's 400 families in my eastern territories who work the corridor markets. That's what this is." Draven looked at him steadily. I know what it is. Then you understand I didn't have a choice. You had choices, Draven said. You chose the ones you chose. His voice was not unkind. It was factual in the way that facts sometimes are when they have been stripped of everything except their essential truth. Bring your trade concerns formally to the alliance negotiation table. If the margin impact is as significant as you're saying, it needs to be addressed in the treaty structure. That's a legitimate argument, and I will hear it. He paused. What I will not hear again is a fabricated complaint against my character or an enforcement action built on documents my aide sold to your network. He held Marin's gaze. We're clear on that. Marin was quiet for a long moment. Seraphine watched the 60 wolves behind him, watched the company commander of the Coalition Enforcement Unit, who was still reading the Highland objection document with the expression of a man who had found a procedural problem he didn't want to own. Watched her father at the gate, with the founding compact held at his side, waiting. She watched Marin make the calculation that was not really a calculation at this point, but was the process a man went through when the decision was already made and he needed the internal architecture to accept it. He turned, looked at his company commander. Stand down, he said. The commander didn't move immediately. He looked at Marin with the complicated expression of someone whose authorization has just been withdrawn in a way he hadn't planned for and needs a moment to recalibrate his own situation. Stand down, Marin said again, quieter, more final. The 60 wolves in southern colors shifted, reorganized. The company commander gave his own signal and the Coalition Enforcement Unit did the same. The courtyard's charged air began very slowly to release. Seraphine exhaled, not visibly, not in a way she let anyone see, just a private release of the thing her lungs had been holding since she watched Marin dismount. Reth stepped back from his blade. She heard it. Draven's hand found her elbow, brief, light. There and then, not there, but she felt the temperature of it through her jacket, and it was the most normal thing anyone had done in the last 4 hours, and the normalcy of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum with the unexpected force of things that have been held at distance for too long. Her father walked into the courtyard. He stopped in front of Marin with the compact tucked under his arm and looked at the man who had brought 60 wolves to his gate with the expression of a Highland king who had made his position clear and was not interested in elaborating on it. You'll be received for formal compact session within the week, he said. Bring your trade documentation. Bring counsel. He paused. Bring fewer wolves. Something moved across Marin's face that might, in a different context, have been almost dry. Yes, King Vale. He walked back to his company. He didn't look at Seraphine again. She wasn't sure if that was concession or pride or some combination that she didn't have the energy to parse right now. It didn't matter. He was leaving. The wolves were leaving. The courtyard was becoming just a courtyard again, stone and cold air and the particular quiet of a space after high tension has passed through it. The rest of the afternoon moved through its necessary processes. The Coalition Enforcement Company required formal documentation of the procedural freeze, which Lady Corvin produced with the efficient precision of a woman who had been preparing documents since before dawn and was not finished. Reth coordinated with her father's guard on the logistical requirements. Marin's riders set camp on the valley road outside the territory boundary, which was the compact's equivalent of a formal pause rather than a withdrawal. But a pause was sufficient. Draven handled his own side of the documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years managing crises and understood that the paperwork was not the bureaucratic aftermath of a conflict, but its actual resolution. She watched him work across a table from her father's senior aide, and she saw, for the first time outside of Drenmore's specific architecture of rank and routine, what he was like in other people's spaces. He was not diminished by them. He was not performing. He occupied each room with the same quality he brought to every room, which was the quality of a man who had understood, at some early and probably difficult point, that authority was not something rooms gave you. She understood that because she had learned it the same way. At the 6th hour, when the documentation was complete, and the formal compact session was scheduled, and the courtyard had been empty for 2 hours, Seraphine found herself sitting on the stone wall of the lower yard, where she had sat at 10 years old, and 13 and 17, and watching the Highland Valley go golden in the late afternoon light. She heard his boots on the stone path. He sat beside her, Not close enough to require acknowledgement, just present. They sat in silence for a while. The valley light moved the way highland light always moved, slow and horizontal, touching the far ridges first and working down toward the valley floor, in a gradient that had no urgency to it. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She considered the question genuinely. "I'm thinking about the fact that I spent 2 years being very careful," she said. "Careful about my name. Careful about what I wanted. Careful about who I let close enough to see anything real." She watched the light on the ridge. "And all of that carefulness brought me here, which is exactly where I was going to end up anyway, just slower." "You think the carefulness was wasted?" "No." She thought about that more precisely. "I think it was necessary. I needed to know what I was made of when I was the only person responsible for knowing it, before I could trust anyone else to know it." She paused. "But I think I kept being careful after the necessity had passed, because careful was familiar and familiar was manageable, and I had confused managing things with being all right." He was quiet for a moment. "I did the same thing," he said. "Different mechanics, same result." She looked at him. "I watched you for 2 years from a careful distance," he said, "and told myself I was respecting your choices when I was also protecting myself from the specific difficulty of wanting something I wasn't sure I could have." His voice was even, not confessional exactly, more like a man stating a fact he has recently confirmed and is adjusting to. "I have spent 20 years being the person every other person in a room was accounting for. That produces a specific kind of loneliness that is very easy to mistake for strength." The valley light reached the lower slopes. "I know that loneliness," she said. "I know you do." She looked at him on the stone wall of her father's lower yard with the highland afternoon going golden around them, and she felt, with the particular precision of things finally understood in their full dimension, that this was what she had been building toward in 2 years of pre-dawn yards and careful distances. Not arriving at safety, not finding a fortress that couldn't be breached, arriving at the specific, difficult, irreplaceable thing that happened when 2 people who had learned to endure alone decided to stop. Not because enduring was finished, because enduring was the floor, not the ceiling. She said, "I want to go back to Drenmore." He looked at her. "After the formal registration, after the compact session, after whatever process Marin's trade concerns require." She held his gaze. "I want to go back. Not because the alliance requires it, and not because the bloodline requires it." She paused. "Because I left my guard jacket on a barracks bench, and I'd like to get it back." Something happened on his face. The expression she had no category for completed itself, finally, into something she recognized because she had felt the same thing move through her own chest, and she knew what it looked like from the outside now. It looked like relief. Not the relief of a problem solved, the relief of a question answered that had been asked for a very long time. "The jacket," he said. "Mira kept it. She's like that." "She is." A pause. "She'll want a formal acknowledgement for the service record." "She deserves one." "Yes." They sat with the valley light until it reached the floor and the temperature began to drop in the way highland temperatures dropped, fast and without negotiation. She didn't move immediately when the cold came, and he didn't move either, and they sat in the cold together on a stone wall she had sat on at 10 years old, not knowing what the years between then and now would cost her, not knowing what they would build, and she found, sitting there, that she could not untangle the cost from the building and would not have chosen to even if she could. The process took 9 days. She had estimated days and she had been right, which she noted without particular satisfaction because being right about difficult things had never felt like winning. The formal compact session was held on day 3. Marin presented his trade documentation, which was, as he had indicated, legitimate and specific and represented a genuine economic impact on real people in his territories. Draven's trade advisors had ridden in from Drenmore by day 2. The negotiation was methodical and uncomfortable and produced by the session's end a modified alliance structure that addressed the corridor market margins through a graduated adjustment schedule rather than an immediate cut. It was not everything Marin wanted. It was not nothing. Marin signed the compact session record at the end of day 3 with the expression of a man who had expected to win everything and had settled for something real, which was, she thought, a better outcome than either full victory or full defeat. She had watched enough political processes to know that the agreements that lasted were the ones that left everyone slightly unsatisfied, because slight dissatisfaction meant both sides had moved. Torvek's formal confession was filed with the Coalition Council on day 4. The Chancellor, found at a transit outpost 3 days' ride east, was brought back under compact authority on day 6. Celine Veyer's attorneys filed a formal withdrawal of all outstanding claims on day 5, which surprised Seraphine until it didn't. Celine was precise, and she was, under the calculation, intelligent enough to understand that the mathematical situation had changed. Whatever Marin had promised her was no longer deliverable. She cut her losses. Seraphine could not find it in herself to wish her badly. She found she could not wish her well either. She filed that in the category of things she would think about properly when she had the time and energy. Theron gave his full formal account on day 4. He sat across from Reth in a compact session room and laid out everything he knew, which was more than she had expected and organized in a way that suggested he had been holding it in order for some time, waiting for a moment to give it. When the session ended, he stood in the corridor and looked at Seraphine with the expression she had seen in the council room, the wondering one, the one that didn't know what to do with itself. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just want you to know I understood, eventually, what I did. Not right away, but eventually." She looked at him. "What did you do with that understanding?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came back in here," he said, "when I could have left with the Southern Riders. I stayed and gave the account." He paused. "I don't know if that counts for anything." She considered him. The man she had built a story around for 2 years, the warmth she had found compelling before she understood how precisely calibrated it was, the cowardice he had named himself in her father's council room. She looked at all of it and found that what she felt was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied a debt, and she didn't want his debt. What she felt was closer to the absence of weight, the particular lightness that came when a story you've been carrying sets itself down. "It counts," she said, "for what it is." He nodded, walked away. She stood in the corridor and took one clean breath and let the last of it go. The Alliance registration was completed on day 9 at the 2nd hour of the morning, not because the 2nd hour of the morning was ceremonially significant, but because that was when the final documentation cleared the Compact Council's formal review and the registrar was available, and Seraphine had decided 3 days prior that she was not going to attach any more symbolism to the process than was already built into it. It had enough weight. It didn't need more. She and Draven sat across from the compact registrar at a plain table in the council records room with Lady Corvin and her father as witnesses, and they gave their formal statements, and the registrar recorded them, and the alliance between the Crown of Drenmore and the Vale bloodline of the Southern Highland territories was formally, irrevocably documented. Afterwards, in the records room's corridor with the cold morning quiet around them, her father embraced her. She had not expected it. Her father was not a demonstrative man. He had shown love through the careful architecture of provisions and preparations, through unlocked doors and messages that said, "I am not writing to summon you," through spending 9 days in formal sessions dismantling a trap built around her without once making her feel the dismantling was about his pride rather than her freedom. She held him for a moment with her face against his shoulder, the way she had at 6 years old, when the world felt too large and she was working out how to stand upright in it. He said, quietly, into her hair, "I'm sorry for the choices I made when you were young." She pulled back, looked at him. His face was the face she had memorized at 17 and had been carrying forward, and it was older now and more honest in the way that faces became more honest when they stopped managing themselves. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That's all?" "That's everything," she said. "That's the whole thing." He nodded, stepped back, became a king again in the space of a breath, which was a trick she recognized because she had inherited it. They rode back to Drenmore on the 11th day. The mountain road looked different in the direction of return. Same rock, same switchbacks, same ice at the high pass. She thought about the version of herself who had ridden this road 11 days earlier with a pack on her horse and the intention of going home, and she thought about how home was a thing she had redefined so many times it had stopped feeling like a fixed point and had become instead a quality, something that existed in the relationship between a person and the place they chose to keep returning to. Mira was in the courtyard when they arrived. She looked at Seraphine with the expression of someone who has been keeping track from a distance and has allowed herself, in the privacy of her own chest, to care how things came out. "The jacket's in the secondary chest," she said. "Where you left it." "I know," Seraphine said. "Thank you." Mira looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Draven with the particular assessment of a senior soldier evaluating a situation she has been watching develop for 2 years and has arrived at a conclusion about. She gave a single, small nod that contained more than any speech she might have made. Draven received it with equal economy. The formal announcement of the alliance and the bonding was scheduled for the following week. Seraphine knew, when she thought about it clearly, that it would be significant. The Empire would attend to it. The old bloodlines would orient around it. There would be ceremony and documentation and the full institutional weight of 2 kingdoms formally joining their futures. She was not afraid of that. She had stood in enough rooms and written her name on enough documents and said her name aloud enough times in the last 11 days that the institutional weight no longer felt like something that would crush her. It felt like something she was part of, something she had helped to build, piece by piece, across 2 years she'd spent thinking she was just surviving. She found the jacket in the secondary chest exactly where Mira said it was, and she put it on in the empty barracks room with the morning light coming through the high windows. And she sat on the bench for a moment with the smell of iron and frost and 2 years of dawn training, and she sat with the full weight of everything she had been when she first came to Drenmore, and the full weight of who she was leaving it. They were not as different as she had once needed them to be. The woman who had arrived here with a false name and a practiced sword, and the deliberate smallness of someone who has decided that invisibility is survival. She had not been wrong. She had been necessary. She had been the foundation that the current version required. You could not get from there to here without going through the specific difficulty of learning yourself in the absence of every external structure that had defined you. But a foundation was not a life. A foundation was where life started. She folded the jacket over her arm and walked back out into the yard. Draven was there. He was not doing anything in particular, which she was learning was how he occupied spaces when he wasn't performing any function for them, just standing in the morning light with the quality of a man who has reached the end of a very long campaign and found, on the other side of it, something he hadn't fully allowed himself to anticipate. She walked to him and stood beside him, left side, her choice. He looked at her, then at the jacket over her arm. "Still fits," she said. "Does it?" "More or less." He looked at the yard. The training area, the practice targets, the frost on the stone that would be gone by mid-morning. The empty space where she had stood every day before the birds arrived and built herself into something that could endure. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." He looked at her directly. "When you stay this time, Ma, and I'm not asking you to confirm that you're staying, that's your answer to give. But when you stay, I want to know what you want. Not what the Alliance needs, not what the compact requires." His voice was steady and entirely without its usual armoring. "What you want." She stood in the training yard of Drenmore with the jacket that smelled like 2 years of her own survival draped over her arm, and the man who had watched her from a careful distance for every one of those 2 years standing beside her in the morning light. And she thought about the question with the full, honest attention it deserved. She thought about what it meant to want something after years of training yourself to need only what you could provide alone. Wanting was a kind of vulnerability she had classified for a long time as a liability. Something to be managed, something that made you a bridge for other people's ambitions if you weren't precise about where you placed it. She had been precise. She had placed it carefully. She had placed it here. "I want to be here," she said. "I want the yard in the morning. I want Mira's quarterly complaints about supply allocation. I want the council table and the difficult sessions and the work of it." She paused. "I want to build something that lasts, not because it carries my name on a document." She looked at him. "Because I helped make it real." He was quiet for a moment. "And you," she said. "And me," he said. Not a question, not uncertain, just confirmed. The way you confirm a thing you have known for long enough that the knowing has become structural, part of the load-bearing architecture of who you are. She put her hand on the yardstone beside them, felt the cold of it, the familiar texture, the particular solidity of a thing that had been here longer than either of them and would be here after. "I'm staying," she said. The sun crested the eastern wall. It hit the iron veining in the black granite the way it always did, producing for a moment the thing that looked almost beautiful from a distance and was, on closer inspection, just the way light and stone interacted when the angle was right. Not magic, not destiny, just elements that happened to align. She had spent a long time deciding that close inspection was the honest approach, that distance was illusion and proximity was truth. Standing in the yard with the morning on the stone and Draven beside her, and the whole ongoing difficult work of building something real ahead of them, she found that she had been half right about that too. Some things were beautiful both ways, from a distance because of what they promised, up close because of what they were. She picked up a practice blade from the rack and held it with the weight she knew in her palms like her own name. She handed it to him. He took it. They worked in the morning yard before the birds arrived, the way she always had, except not alone. And the difference between those two versions of the same action was not smaller for being quiet. It was not larger for being witnessed. It was exactly the size of a choice made freely by a woman who had learned, at some cost and across considerable distance, that the bravest thing she had ever done was not survive. It was decide to stay.